Tahoe's water level has dropped to a 4-year low. It was hovering around the natural rim, but this week it fell just below it.
In 2014, a team of deep water divers descended into the darkness of Lake Tahoe, almost 1,000 feet below the surface. Their lights swept across something that shouldn't have been there. A human body fully clothed, hair still attached, skin still intact, suspended upright in the water as if frozen mid-stride. He'd been down there for decades, and he wasn't alone. Divers have pulled from the bottom of Lake Tahoe over the last 50 years doesn't just defy what we know about the lake. It defies what we know about preservation, about American history, about indigenous warnings that were dismissed for centuries, and about what the U.S. government has been quietly doing beneath the surface of one of the most photographed lakes on Earth. Mafia victims preserved like museum exhibits. A 6,000-year-old forest still standing upright underwater. A 19th century steamship sitting on the lake floor in such pristine condition that its brass fittings still shine. Geometric structures captured on sonar that scientists refuse to explain, and a Native American legend about something living at the bottom that when modern researchers finally listened turned out to be terrifyingly accurate. This is the story of what's really at the bottom of Lake Tahoe. And by the end of it, you'll understand why one of the most famous oceanographers of the 20th century allegedly surfaced from a dive there, refused to release his footage, and reportedly said the world wasn't ready for what he saw. To understand what makes Tahoe different from every other lake in North America, you have to start with the numbers. Tahoe is the second deepest lake in the United States. At its deepest point, it plunges 1,645 feet straight down. That's deeper than the Empire State Building is tall. If you drop the Eiffel Tower into the middle of the lake, the top of it would still be more than 600 foot underwater. Depth alone isn't what makes Tahoe strange. What makes Tahoe strange is what happens once you go past 700 feet at that depth. Sunlight stops penetrating. The temperature drops to a constant 39 degrees Fahrenheit and stays there year-round. Oxygen levels collapse. Material activity slows to almost nothing, and the pressure becomes intense enough to crush most organic matter against the lake floor, but not enough to break it apart. In other words, the bottom of Lake Tahoe is a refrigerator, a massive lightless oxygen-starved refrigerator that has been operating continuously for the last 2 million years. Anything that sinks into it doesn't rot. It doesn't decompose. It doesn't get eaten. It just sits there exactly the way it landed, sometimes for centuries. This is why the story started in the 1970s. According to legend, the legendary French oceanographer Jacques Cousteau brought a submersible to Lake Tahoe sometime during that decade. He'd already explored the Mediterranean, the Caribbean, the Red Sea. Tahoe was supposed to be a routine freshwater dive. When Cousteau resurfaced, witnesses claimed he was visibly shaken. He refused to discuss what he'd seen. He never released his footage. And in a quote that has been repeated for 50 years across journalism, documentaries, and local tour guides, he allegedly told a reporter, "The world isn't ready for what's down there." The Cousteau family has denied this story for decades. Footage, if it exists, has never been seen. But the quote stuck because once you understand what's actually been pulled from the lake floor since then, it's hard not to believe him. Let's start with the bodies. In 2011, a recreational diver named Donald Winker pushed past the recommended depth limit in Tahoe and descended to a record 423 feet. At that depth, his lights illuminated something his brain refused to process. A man in a 1940s-style suit, fully intact, fingers preserved down to the fingernails, face still recognizable. Body wasn't decomposing. It wasn't bloated. It looked, in Winker's own words, like a wax figure from a museum. He photographed it. He surfaced. He reported it to authorities. The body has never been identified. It isn't the only one. Tahoe straddles the border between California and Nevada. Reno, just 30 m east, was a hub of organized crime activity from the 1920s through the 1960s. Casinos at South Lake Tahoe were tied directly to mafia interests in Las Vegas and Chicago. And Lake Tahoe, with its extreme depth and total absence of decomposition, was the perfect place to dispose of bodies. According to local divers and law enforcement sources, the lake floor contains an unknown number of mafia-era victims, some still tied to weights, some still wearing the clothes they were murdered in. Bodies don't sink the way they would in warmer water. The cold preserves them. Lack of bacterial gas means they don't refloat. They simply hover. And here's where it gets genuinely strange. Because of the lake's pressure gradient, some bodies appear to remain upright in the water column, suspended at the depth where their density matches the water around them. Divers have reported encountering corpses standing as if walking the lake floor, eyes open, clothing intact. In one case, a diver reported encountering a body whose pocket watch was still attached, the chain visible against the fabric of a suit jacket that hadn't deteriorated in over 70 years. The local authorities don't talk about this publicly. The Tahoe tourism industry doesn't acknowledge it. Ask any deep water diver who's worked the lake and they'll tell you the same thing. There are people down there, hundreds, possibly thousands, and they're not going anywhere. In 2017, a sonar survey conducted off the South Lake Tahoe shoreline detected what appeared to be human-shaped objects clustered together at approximately 600 feet of depth. Cluster contained at least 9 distinct figures arranged in what one analyst described as a deliberate configuration. Findings were reported quietly to local law enforcement. The site has never been excavated. The cluster has never been disturbed. According to the dive team that filed the original report, the configuration suggested a single event. Multiple bodies deposited at the same location at the same time waited in a way that kept them grouped together as they sank. Whoever they were, they went down together and they have been down there together, perfectly preserved ever since. So, if Tahoe preserves a 1940s mafia victim like he was murdered yesterday, what else has it preserved? That question brought a team of researchers from the United States Geological Survey to the lake in the early 2000s. They weren't looking for bodies. They were mapping the underwater topography using high-resolution sonar. What they found at a depth of around 300 feet stopped the project cold. A forest. An entire forest of fully grown pine trees still standing upright. Roots still anchored in the soil. Branches still extended exactly as they had been when they were alive. The trees weren't drifting. They weren't laid flat against the lake floor. They were standing as if the entire forest had simply been swallowed by the water around it and left undisturbed. Carbon dating of wood samples extracted from the submerged trees returned a date of approximately 6,000 years before present. That means at some point in the recent geological past, the level of Lake Tahoe was hundreds of feet lower than it is today. Coniferous forest grew along the ancient shoreline, and then somehow that forest was inundated quickly enough that the trees never had time to fall. This isn't a theory. It's been documented. The USGS published the findings. You can find the biometric maps online. Here's the question no one wants to answer. What kind of event raises a lake by hundreds of feet without uprooting the forest growing along its edge? Most flooding events involve violent movement, rivers overflowing, dams breaking, ice melting. Those events tend to topple trees, not preserve them. For a forest to be inundated and left standing, the water level would have to rise relatively slowly, but rise high enough to drown mature pine trees that had been growing for decades. There's another possibility, one that geologists at the University of Nevada have quietly raised but never fully published. What if the floor of the lake dropped? What if a geological event around 6,000 years ago caused a massive subsidence in the Tahoe Basin, sinking the forest below the existing waterline? That would explain the preservation. It would also explain something else we'll come back to later. Because Tahoe sits on an active fault, and what's happening beneath that fault is something the U.S. Geological Survey has been monitoring with growing concerns since 2011. Forest itself, when divers have managed to reach it, presents a sight that researchers describe as deeply unsettling. Trees stand in formation, branches still extended outward, in some cases with bark still intact. Water clarity at that depth is exceptional, and the lighting from a diver's torch can illuminate dozens of trees at once. The effect, according to one diver who descended to the site in 2008, is like swimming through a forest that has simply forgotten to be alive. Nothing moves, nothing grows. Pine needles that should have fallen and decayed thousands of years ago are gone, but the structures of the trees themselves remain, frozen at the exact moment the water swallowed them. It is, in a literal sense, a photograph of an ancient world, and it has been hanging in the dark, waiting to be found for as long as recorded human civilization has existed. Before we get to the geology, we have to talk about the ships. In 1940, the steamship SS Tahoe was scuttled in the deepest part of the lake. The ship had been the pride of the Tahoe fleet for nearly 40 years, carrying passengers and cargo between the lake's resort towns from 1896 onward. When she was retired, her owner decided she should sink into the lake she had served, and so she was towed to deep water, open to the elements, and sent to the bottom. She landed at a depth of approximately 400 feet upright, intact, and there she has remained untouched for over 80 years. In 2002, a team of divers using technical equipment finally reached her. What they found shouldn't have been possible. Brass fittings on the deck still gleamed. The wood paneling in the cabins was unrotted. Glass windows were unbroken. Even the painted lettering on the hull was still legible. The SS Tahoe looked, in the words of one diver, like she had been scuttled the day before, not 80 years earlier. She is not the only ship down there. Tahoe Maritime Museum has identified at least 8 major vessels resting on the lake floor, several of them in similar states of preservation. There are paddle steamers from the logging era. There are wooden barges. There are small craft from the early 20th centuries that simply vanished one day and were assumed lost. They weren't lost, they sank. Because Tahoe doesn't allow decomposition the way other lakes do, they're still there, perfectly intact, waiting. The ships are only the obvious artifacts. The real story is what's been found scattered around them. In the mid-1800s, tens of thousands of Chinese laborers worked the Comstock lode silver mines in Nevada, just over the mountains from Lake Tahoe. They built railroads. They cut timber. They lived in communities along the lake's shores. And and when the silver boom collapsed in the 1880s, many of them simply vanished from the historical record. Local history suggests that anti-Chinese violence in the region was severe. Communities were burned, workers were forced out, and in some cases, entire settlements appear to have been wiped from the landscape with almost no archaeological trace. Except, according to divers, the trace is at the bottom of the lake. Ceramic shards from Qing dynasty pottery have recovered from depths exceeding 200 feet, copper coins stamped with Chinese characters, mining tools forged in a style associated with 19th century Chinese metallurgy. In one report from 2008, a research team described finding what appeared to be the foundation of a small wooden structure on the lake floor with associated household artifacts scattered around it. The implication, never officially confirmed, was that an entire Chinese settlement may have been submerged when the lake levels shifted in the late 19th century, or more disturbingly, that something else happened to it. There are local legends in the Tahoe area, mostly forgotten now, about Chinese laborers being driven into the lake during the worst of the 1880s anti-immigrant violence. Legends have never been substantiated by mainstream historians. The artifacts on the lake floor suggest that whatever happened to those communities, the evidence of their existence wasn't destroyed. It was preserved, just like the bodies, just like the ships, just like the forest by the cold and the dark and the pressure of America's deepest lake. And now we get to the part that even the most skeptical researchers admit is hard to explain. In 1962, at the height of the Cold War, the United States Navy established a research facility on the western shore of Lake Tahoe. The facility was called the Naval Undersea Warfare Center Tahoe Division. Its official purpose was to test sonar equipment and submarine acoustic profiles in a controlled freshwater environment. Tahoe, with its extreme depth, its exceptional clarity, and its consistent temperature, mimicked deep ocean conditions almost perfectly. It was, in the Navy's own internal documents, the perfect testing ground. But here's what the public was never told. Navy didn't just test sonar at Tahoe. They tested experimental submersibles. They tested classified communication systems. And according to declassified documents from the 1970s, they conducted multiple operations involving the deployment and recovery of unmanned underwater vehicles at depth exceeding 2,200 feet. Some of those vehicles were never recovered. According to a Freedom of Information Act request filed in 2009, the Navy acknowledged that at least 6 separate pieces of classified equipment were lost in Lake Tahoe between 1965 and 1988. Nature of that equipment has never been disclosed. The Navy has refused to detail what kind of vehicles they were, what they were carrying, or whether they contained nuclear or radiological material. They have simply confirmed that the equipment is at the bottom of the lake, that it has not been recovered, and that the recovery zones are classified. In 1996, the facility was officially closed. The buildings were repurposed, the signage was removed, and the Navy's involvement in Lake Tahoe was for the most part scrubbed from the public record. The equipment, whatever it is still down there. There is one more detail from the Cold War era that researchers continue to debate. In the 1970s and 1980s, several civilian divers reported strange encounters at depth. Powerful underwater lights that switched on and off in sequence. Mechanical sounds that didn't match any known marine equipment. And in one case in 1983, a recreational diver named Walt Robinson reported being followed at 280 feet by what he described as a metallic object moving on its own power, approximately the size of a small car. Robinson surfaced immediately. His dive computer logged the encounter. The object was never identified. The official explanation was that he had encountered a Navy test vehicle. The Navy, when asked, declined to confirm or deny. They simply repeated that the depths of Lake Tahoe were used for classified research and that civilians who dove there did so at their own risk. What makes the situation more disturbing is what happened after the facility officially closed. In 2003, fishermen on the lake's western shore reported pulling up segments of heavy gauge cable from depths of around 200 feet. Cable wasn't consistent with anything the local utility companies had installed. It was military sheathed in materials designed to withstand extreme pressure and temperature. When the segments were turned over to authorities, they were collected within 48 hours by personnel who did not identify themselves. Fishermen were asked not to discuss the recovery. No further explanation was provided. Whatever the cable had been connected to remains presumably still anchored somewhere on the lake floor, leading to something the public has never been allowed to see. Which raises the question, if the Navy was running experimental vehicles in Lake Tahoe in the 1980s, what were they testing them on? And what else, anything, did they find down there? That question became significantly more pressing in 2011. That year, a team of scientists from the University of California, Davis, conducted the most comprehensive sonar mapping of Lake Tahoe's floor ever attempted. Using multi-beam sonar at a resolution never previously achieved in a freshwater environment, they imaged every square meter of the lake bottom. Data set was massive. The interpretation was supposed to be straightforward. Catalog the topography, identify geological features, publish the maps. When the imagery was processed, the team found something they couldn't easily classify. In the deepest part of the lake near the geographic center, the sonar revealed a series of geometric formations on the lake floor. Formations were arranged in patterns, straight lines, right angles, rectangular shapes that didn't match the surrounding geological features. They covered an area of approximately several hundred square meters at a depth exceeding 1,500 feet. The official interpretation published in a 2013 paper was that the formations represented debris from an ancient underwater landslide. The angular shapes, according to the geologists, were the broken edges of a large rock slab that had collapsed off the lake's flank, possibly during the same event that submerged the underwater forest 6,000 years earlier. The interpretation was reasonable. It fit the existing geological framework, and it ended the official discussion. The imagery told a different story to anyone outside the geological establishment. The shapes look structural. They look engineered. The lines are too straight. The angles are too consistent. And the location in the deepest, most inaccessible part of the lake is exactly where you would expect to find evidence of something that whoever built it didn't want found. The UC Davis team has never returned to the site for follow-up investigation. The Navy facility is closed, and the geometric formations remain on the official maps classified as landslide debris, even though no follow-up coring or sampling has ever been done to confirm that interpretation. Whatever they are, they're still down there. And here's the part that makes the geological story impossible to ignore. Lake Tahoe is not a quiet lake. It sits along the West Tahoe Fault, an active geological boundary that runs the length of the basin. The fault has produced significant earthquakes in the recent geological past, including at least 2 events estimated to have exceeded magnitude 7 within the last 15,000 years. And according to studies published by the United States Geological Survey in 2018, the fault is overdue for another major rupture. The earthquake risk isn't the most alarming thing about the lake's geology. The most alarming thing is what was found at the bottom of the basin. In 2014, a team of researchers from the University of Nevada, Reno deployed deep water temperature sensors across the lake floor as part of a hydrothermal survey. They expected to find that the bottom temperature was constant. It wasn't. In several specific locations near the deepest point of the lake, they detected localized heat anomalies, plumes of warm water rising from the lake floor at temperatures significantly higher than the surrounding 39 degrees Fahrenheit. What they had found was active hydrothermal venting, underwater hot springs connected to a magma chamber beneath the Tahoe Basin. Subsequent investigation in 2019 identified a previously unmapped volcanic structure on the southern edge of the lake. It is not currently erupting, but it is not dormant either. It is, in the geological terminology, persistently active. If that volcanic system were to erupt, or if a major earthquake on the West Tahoe Fault triggered a large underwater landslide, the result would be a phenomenon called a SE, a standing wave generated by the displacement of lake water. Computer models suggest that a major tsicha on Lake Tahoe could send waves up to 30 feet high crashing into the shoreline communities within minutes. Tens of thousands of people live in those communities. Most of them have never heard the word sish. None of them are prepared for what could happen if the lake decides to move. Cold, the dark, the lack of decomposition that has preserved every body, every ship, every artifact at the bottom of Tahoe for the last several thousand years would receive a fresh deposit. Everything currently on the shoreline, everyone currently in those waters, pulled down, preserved, added to the collection. But before we close this story, we have to talk about the fish. Lake Tahoe contains a population of lake trout, also called macho, that grow to sizes that biologists struggle to fully explain. Species was introduced to the lake in the late 19th century, and in most environments, lake trout reach a maximum size of around 30 to 40 pounds. In Tahoe, however, specimens exceeding 6 feet in length have been documented. The official record stands at just over 37 pounds, but local fishermen and dive operators have reported sightings of significantly larger individuals at depth. Phenomenon is called aquatic gigantism. In environments where prey is abundant, predators are absent, and conditions are stable, fish can continue growing for decades beyond their normal lifespan. Tahoe provides exactly those conditions. The deep water is cold and stable. There are no natural predators for adult lake trout, and the lake's introduced cookie salmon population provides a virtually unlimited food source. Here's what's strange. The largest specimens, the ones reportedly exceeding 6 feet, have only been observed at extreme depths below 600 feet. They are rarely caught. They are almost never photographed, and there is a persistent local legend dismissed by most biologists that something significantly larger than a macho lives in the deepest part of the lake. Legend has a name, Tehotesi. Most accounts describe a long-bodied serpentine creature, dark in color, capable of moving at high speed underwater. Stories are old. They predate European contact. In 2004, a charter boat captain operating out of Tahoe Keys reported pulling up a fish so large such that his commercial-grade equipment failed to hold it. Cable snapped. Whatever was on the other end of it descended back into the dark and was never recovered. Captain estimated the weight at over 200 pounds. Lake trout are not supposed to reach that size. Nothing in Lake Tahoe, according to official biology, is supposed to reach that size. But something did. Something that was strong enough to break tackle, rated for ocean fishing, something that returned to the depths and was never seen again. There are dozens of similar stories. Captains who don't speak on the record. Tour operators who tell their families to stay out of the water past sundown. Local guides who refuse to take clients into certain coves with no explanation given. And that brings us to the final piece of this story, the one that makes everything else fall into place. What people have lived in the Lake Tahoe basin for at least 6,000 years. Their oral traditions passed down across hundreds of generations contain detailed knowledge about the lake that modern science has only recently begun to confirm. Wow word for Lake Tahoe is demeaning simply the lake. To them, it was the center of the world, most sacred place in their territory and the most dangerous. According to Wu tradition, the lake was inhabited by beings they called the water babies. The water babies were not children. They were powerful ancient entities that lived in the deepest parts of the lake. They could pull swimmers and bores down to the bottom. They were responsible for unexplained drownings, for the disappearance of canoes, for the sudden storms that turned calm water deadly within minutes. Lo knew which parts of the lake to avoid. They knew which beaches were safe and which were not. They knew that certain areas of the shoreline should never be approached after dark and that certain depths should never be entered at all. For over a century, anthropologists dismissed the water babies as folklore. Drownings in Lake Tahoe, they argued, were just the normal accidents of a large alpine lake. The storms were weather. The disappearing boats were navigation errors. There was no scientific basis for treating the WO warnings as anything more than mythology. Someone actually checked the data. In 2019, a research project at the University of Nevada compiled drowning statistics for Lake Tahoe across the last 150 years and mapped them against the locations the WO traditionally identified as dangerous. Correlation was almost perfect. The areas the WO had warned about, the specific beaches, the specific depths, the specific zones accounted for over 70% of all unexplained drownings in the lake's recorded history. Modern victims with no knowledge of what oral tradition were dying in exactly the locations that had been identified as dangerous thousands of years before. Researchers couldn't explain the correlation. They suggested possibilities. Underwater currents, perhaps localized temperature shifts, submerged debris that creates suction effects near the surface. None of the proposed mechanisms fully account for the pattern. Whatever the Wu knew about Lake Tahoe, they knew it with a precision that modern oceanography is only beginning to match. That's the question this entire story leaves you with. Because if the Wu were right about the dangerous zones, what else were they right about? The water babies. The legend says they are still down there. The legend says they live in the deepest, coldest, darkest part of the lake. Legend says they are old. Older than human memory. Older than the trees that stand drowned at 300 feet. Older than the basin itself. Legend says they pull people down. The science says the lake preserves everything that touches its floor. Science says bodies have been hanging in the water column upright, undisturbed for over 100 years. The science says there are geometric structures at 500 feet that no one has explained. The science says the Navy lost classified equipment down there and refuses to say what it was. The science says there is a volcano beneath the lake and a fault waiting to slip and fish growing to impossible sizes in the dark. The science says eventually that the lake will do what lakes do. It will move. It will rise. It will swallow whatever is on the shoreline and add it to what is already on the bottom. Mafia victims and submerged forests and Chinese settlements and naval equipment and ships and pottery and bones and whatever else has been lying in that water for the last 6,000 years. When new, they tried to tell us. We didn't listen. There is one last detail from the Wow tradition that researchers have struggled to reconcile with everything else we've covered. We described the water babies as beings that do not age. They do not die. They have been in the lake since before the lake had a name. They watch the surface. They remember every person who has ever entered the water, and they will eventually claim everyone who disturbs them. Tradition is specific. The tradition is detailed, and the tradition has been passed down generation after generation across the same 6,000 years that the submerged forest has stood drowned at 300 feet across the same period that the geometric structures on the lake floor have remained unexplained across the same span of time during which everything else at the bottom of Lake Tahoe has been quietly waiting. Divers who go down there now go with technical equipment, mixed gas, rebreathers, decompression schedules calculated to the minute. They know the lake won't let them stay long. They know that beyond a certain depth, the cold and the pressure and the dark become an environment human beings were never meant to occupy. They know there are things down there that have been waiting much longer than any of us have been alive. They go anyway. They photograph. They document. They surface with stories that the official channels never publish and the tour guides never tell and the tourism boards never acknowledge. Come back almost without exception change. Because once you have seen a face looking back at you from 400 foot down, intact, eyes open, perfectly preserved by the cold and the dark for 100 years, you understand something that most people who visit Lake Tahoe will never understand. The lake is not a recreational destination. It is not a vacation spot. It is not the crystal blue postcard image that hangs in hotel lobbies from Reno to Sacramento. The lake is a vault, and what's inside the vault has been accumulating for thousands of years. The bodies are real. The forest is real. The ships are real. The artifacts are real. The classified equipment is real. Geometric structures on the lake floor are real. The hydrothermal vents are real. The fault is real. The volcano is real. The drowning pattern matching the wash maps is real. Lake trout reaching impossible sizes are real. Somewhere in the deepest, darkest part of that 1,645-foot vault, the cold and the silence and the perfect preserving pressure of 2 million years of geological patience, the W show say something is still moving. Something they tried to warn us about. Something the science doesn't have a name for yet. The divers keep going down. Lake keeps preserving everything they find. The truth at the bottom of Lake Tahoe. The truth that Jacques Cousteau allegedly saw and refused to share. The truth that the Navy classified and the geologists explained away and the tourism board pretended didn't exist, is still down there waiting exactly the way it has been waiting for the last 6,000 years. Still 1,645 foot down. Still 39 degrees. Still preserved, still watching, and still by every available measure not finished collecting.